The American sacrifices for Ukraine are not as great as they seem, because a lot of that has gone back into American pockets. The real sacrifices, again, this is a Pole patting himself on the back, the real sacrifice for Ukraine has largely been from the Poles.
In what ways?
Always. In money, weapons, and taking in Ukrainian refugees. There are up to 2 million Ukrainians living in Poland now.
I have another question.
Sure.
I don't know how deep into this rabbit hole you would like to go. But I was thinking about the lecture that I saw in your book about why the Polish involvement and the Polish heroism in World War II was erased, not included in Hollywood culture and in film, and the reasons for that, the need to not anger Russia at the time, and because there was I think part of your argument too is that Hollywood was run by Jews, and Jews had difficulties with the Polish people at a time, and some of those reasons during that time in history. Okay, full stop. I've also felt, even now, even today, it does feel like Poland is left out of the international conversation. We do have a war going on. And I don't often hear about the Polish perspective of that war.
No.
What does the world need to know about the Polish perspective in terms of what's happening between the Russians and the Ukrainians?
Well, we immediately confront one problem, and that is psychologically the Americans, no matter what happens, no matter when we are isolationists. And for the Americans, foreign involvement may initially capture your imagination and passion. It quickly fades from that.
When it becomes expensive.
When it becomes expensive, when it's distracting. If you tell an American we're going to send this amount of money to Ukraine to help the war against the Russians, often you'll get an answer like, but we could take that amount of money and we could do something here domestically. And therefore, why should we send it to a place we don't even know where it is? Where is Ukraine? It could be in Kansas. It doesn't make any difference.
Sure.
So why should Americans send their hard-earned money to places far away, populated by people who are slightly ridiculous? We're going to do that at our own expense. Why should we sacrifice for other people? And the more east you are in Europe, the more likely the Americans are to disdain you.
It becomes more pronounced.
Exactly.
Yes.
So therefore, it's one thing helping the English, and maybe the Irish. The French, that's a little tougher. But to make sacrifices to help a Romanian, a Ukrainian, a Pole, it's like helping someone on Venus.
But hasn't American support come basically to Ukraine through Poland?
Yes. Yes. Actually, the American sacrifices for Ukraine are not as great as they seem, because a lot of that has gone back into American pockets. The real sacrifices, again, this is a Pole patting himself on the back, the real sacrifice for Ukraine has largely been from the Poles.
In what ways?
Always. In money, weapons, and taking in Ukrainian refugees. There are up to 2 million Ukrainians living in Poland now. Poland doesn't have the capacity to be able to house 2 million people. Imagine if the relative number of those compared to people crossing the border into the United States, it would be an interesting comparison. The Poles have millions of Ukrainians who are in dire shape that they have to take care of. And they're not a rich country, but they're doing it. And they are, in some cases openly, in some cases secretly, helping the Ukrainians. And they are the most passionately pro-Ukrainian people in the world. And you have to understand that Poles and Ukrainians traditionally detest one another. So for the Poles basically to tell the Ukrainians, let's let bygones be bygones.
But they detest the Russians more, don't they?
Oh, yes. Well, one of the reasons that Poles traditionally detest Ukrainians is because they reconcile with the Russians and the Poles didn't. And from the Polish point of view, you stabbed us in the back.
You betrayed all of us.
You betrayed us. You should have been with us. And you went with them. And the Russians killed at least 4.5 million of you between 1932 and 1938. And doesn't that tell you something? So I think the Poles are hurt by the fact that they think that they should be recognized as playing a more important role, especially in European affairs, than the EU, for instance, is willing to grant them. And the Poles, for instance, have said repeatedly, The Germans destroyed much of Poland. It has never given us a penny back. The Germans who slaughtered the population of Warsaw in 1944 during the Rising, not one of them was ever put on trial. Many of them had good jobs after the war. These are monsters. They killed innocent people by the thousands and tens of thousands. And yet you let them get away with it. Why didn't you, the Americans, why didn't NATO, why didn't you punish these people? And the answer is because we're the victims and you're not. And to be very blunt about it, you really don't give a damn about us. It's as simple as that. So Polish martyrdom again. And there's nothing more arrogant than being a martyr.
More arrogant than being a martyr?
That's right.
Yeah.
And the Poles are very arrogant.
In the sense that one would use their suffering to control others, to manipulate others?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So then what? So with that knowledge, how might it be helpful for the world to know about the Polish involvement in the war?
How that could be done is difficult to say, and the situation is changing day by day because we don't know how the war will look like in a month, much less how it will end.
Yes.
If the war ends with a Ukrainian victory, which is my prayer, or was at the very least a settlement that both sides can tolerate, Poland's situation, in my estimation, will be improved. Because Poland will have played a large role. The Ukrainians will look upon Poland as their most important ally, and the pathway for Ukrainians to NATO and to the EU will be through Poland. And therefore, Ukraine will become an inevitable Polish ally. And to be very crass about it, add up almost 40 million Poles with 40 million Ukrainians, 80 million people. They're one of the largest countries in Europe. In other words, it would be a very significant center of power.
Yeah.
If Ukraine loses the war, God knows what the Russians will do to them, but Poland will immediately be in danger.
Well, hasn't now I'm out of the game, but hasn't much of what's transpired exposed the weaknesses of the Russian military?
Yes.
Yeah. I think the idea of Russia as a military force there's been some holes poked in that.
Oh, yes. The idea that Russia was alongside the United States, one of the two great military powers in the world, now is looked upon as mere nonsense. Yeah. The Russians, according to the latest estimates, have lost 300,000 men, which is roughly the number of people the Americans lost in all of World War II. So the Russian casualties have been
miscalculated a bit, huh?
Yeah. It's been.
The Ukrainian resolve. Yeah, I think he miscalculated the Ukrainian resolve.
Absolutely. Yeah. The Ukrainians have done better than the Russians thought was even remotely possible. But I think obviously it'll be there's something going on sort of below the horizon that is very interesting, and that is the Poles are members of NATO. They're members of the EU. That means if Poland is invaded by another country, NATO will come to the aid. It's called the fifth factor in NATO.
Yes.
However, the Poles know that they can't count on NATO. They know it.
Yeah.
Why would they? So therefore, the Poles have concluded that the only way Poland will be safe is if Poland can protect Poland with nobody else. And therefore, the Polish military is the most rapidly developing military in the world, with not only number of weapons, but the quality of the weapons. And just recently, a year or so ago, the estimate was that if Poland is invaded by Russia, Poland will last weeks. Now,
not so much.
No. In fact, there's even suggestions that if Russia invades Poland, Poland will win.
And with a depleted military.
Yeah.
Because of having to get through Ukraine.
Right. And because they've been spending so much money on weapons. That sounds fine. It helps Polish self-glorying, but self-glorification. But it's disturbing because what it is also telling us is NATO is so important and the EU is supposedly so important to the world. Why don't the Poles trust them? Are they paranoid? Maybe. Are they right? I think yes. And if you can't trust NATO, and it's a military alliance, who can trust NATO? The British can trust the Americans. Beyond that, I'm not so sure.
Yeah.
The EU, the EU is as an economic, cooperative economic bloc, is good for everybody. The EU, by embroiling itself in the internal workings of every country, by literally doing something like editing the school books in country schools, by penalizing them for domestic legislation, for laws passed, is undermining the sovereignty of its members.
So they become the world police, which attacks the principle of subsidiarity.
Yeah. So the Poles have long ago regarded the EU as invasive and damaging to Polish national sovereignty and Polish national self-respect. And therefore they don't particularly like EU, but they'll never criticize it openly because, frankly, they need them. They need the money of the EU for Poland to be successful.
Yeah.
But a lot of people in the United States, for instance, criticize Poland for not being more pro-EU. But here we have the Turkey issue. From the point of view of Poland, the EU is too modern. And the EU is always talking about modern values. And frankly...
And Poles are traditionalists.
That's right.
Yeah.
What is a modern... to this day, I don't know. I've asked my students, what is a modern value? And if it's modern today, will it be modern tomorrow?
Well, I mean, modern increasingly means postmodern, which is the deconstruction of all institutional norms.
That's right.
Yeah.
Modern is the enemy of tradition. But with this, tradition knows where it's from and therefore has foundations. Modern is just a step into the darkness. You don't know where you're going. You have no idea. And you could change your mind tomorrow, and what was modern today will be regarded as no longer modern tomorrow. It's just chaos.
Sure. Wouldn't the pushback be, though, that, I mean, there are mistakes that have been made within tradition?
Of course.
So we need to learn from those mistakes. And what else but modern progressivism attends to those errors? Well,
yes, I think criticizing and correcting errors in traditionalism is necessary. It's fine. But the question is, on the basis of what critique will you evaluate traditionalism?
Sure.
And in the case of modernism, it's not as though this is the traditional way of doing things. On the basis of these views, we will now improve the situation, because there aren't any these views.
Because that's always changing.
Because that's always changing.
Yeah.
So it's in my estimation, it's ridiculous to tell someone that this traditional behavior is not longer acceptable, because in comparison to what you're doing, you should do, well, whatever this is, but I forgot what it is because we're someplace new now.